Hey everyone, Jake here, creator of Animagraffs, and today I'm going to take you through my 3D tool set and my workflow and just show you how the tools that I've created and that I use in Blender help me make Animagraffs. I have here a project file from the last project I did. If this were an empty, so this has all the collections and all my objects in it, but if this were an empty file, I have these collections, the camera and the scene, the labels and reference. I'll start filling up this reference collection. That would be through Blender's add menu, and I'll just place an image empty. There we go. I'd start rotating this into place. This is my Animagraffs 3D tools menu, and I have a function to set up this reference image so that it names it. Now it's called the name of the image, otherwise it's just called empty in Blender. And it also sets the opacity here in the image properties to 0.4. I could duplicate that and start rotating things around to get it into place if I'm trying to build this truck. I have a function here to toggle the opacity so that I can really see where these lines are lining up. And I can turn the reference collection off or on with this menu as well. I can also do that in edit mode. I can still turn that on or off, the reference collections. It's a little quality of life thing. Once I have some reference images, then I'll probably start modeling. So let's call it whatever, axle. I'll add a circle. Let's go like 16. Yeah. And then I'd be extruding it to the side and maybe something like this. Yeah. All right. My models are really simple. If I zoomed into it, it's real blocky. Looks like old school video game graphics. So obviously I'm going to be subdividing that, but I use the bevel modifier and the subdivide modifier together almost all the time. In my Animagraffs 3D tools menu, bevel and subdiv, they're even coupled up. So this adds the bevel. When I'm editing, I can hit I have a hotkey for it. What this is doing is setting the bevel weight to 1. So if you were to do this without a hotkey, you would select your edges and then come over here and just hit the number 1. But even that to me is too much time. So once you bevel it, what that's actually doing is adding extra edges in here. So the subdivide modifier knows what I want to be sharp, but it still catches the light here. All the complexity in my models comes from this method. So they're really simple. Even the body shape here for this truck, if I go into it, look at that, huge polygons. This thing is a really simple model. When people are designing for realism, their base model might look like this, where it's got a lot of polygons, you know, these little parts of a mesh. My models are always as simple as I can possibly make them. The wheel here is probably more complex because when you have various shapes inside of an object, you're forced to use more complexity. But I'm still using the little bevel edges in here. Look at that. I have this 3D tools menu. And I'll just go through some of the other things that I use very often in this menu. There's the mirror, I use that a ton, so I'll mirror that and we turn off the references. Yeah, so that just quickly mirrors the object with some of the settings I like. So let me delete this, watch this. If you just add a mirror object, a mirror modifier, it puts it at the bottom of the stack after bevel and subdivision, and I don't want that. So I coded so that when I add my mirror modifier, it puts it at the top of the stack automatically, which if you're doing that 100 times in a day, it is nice not to have to do that. What else we got in here? Mirror object. If I solo this engine group here, when I pull apart the heads, I'm using the engine as the mirror object. Yeah, so I move this around, you can see anything that's using that as the object on which to mirror will move with it. But I wrote a little function to like quickly set that kind of mirror up for me. Otherwise, you would have to go in, you can do this by hand, right? You add the mirror modifier and then you get the eyedropper and set the object and all that. But I do this so much during thousands and thousands of times that at this point, I know that I just want that to be in a function. Solidify is great. So I can solidify this and here we go, toggle stack to clean that up. Let's get the thickness going, right? Sure. If I add a bevel to this outer edge, the way my solidify modifier is set up, that bevel comes after the solidify and it gives it a little highlightable edge right there in the solidify modifier. If you've ever used that, you know it's kind of tricky to get this to have that cool beveled edge that you want. It just adds all those modifiers exactly as I like them. The shrink wrap modifier, you've seen that before in my other videos. Array spin. An array spin is one that's no fun to set up if you do it a bunch of times. It uses an object to spin the array around. So if I do 6 of these, you know. And then if I did 20 here, I have a function where I can right click and update the array spin, and it will calculate the angle of this object. Select the modifier target. Yeah, so there's an empty object here. There it is. It's hard to see it because there's so much going on, but that empty object is what's telling the array modifier how to do its job. If I tone this back down to 3, you can see the angle's not right. It thinks it would still be 20, so update array spin, and it puts the angle correct. Compound angle, this is really cool. For a second here, let's build like an airplane wing with a flap in it. This is where I often use something like that, because an airplane wing is going to be angled in a bunch of really interesting and cool ways, you know. So this is not just a flat plane. There's a lot going on. So inside of there'll be like a flap, right? Like right here, this thing right here. Let's see if we can angle it even more, you know. Yeah, we'll just give it a wacky angle. This thing would be a flap, right? So we'll separate that and move that just a little bit, just so that it has, this is this offset edges plugin is just something that comes with Blender you can turn on. But this moves that in just a tiny bit from where it was. Now, I need to put the origin point right on that center line there. If this is an airplane wing and I want to rotate these flaps up and down, I can't get it to like rotate properly, especially if I do it from over here. Look at this. It looks all busted. With the compound angle, I can place this empty, and then all I do is line it up to where that flap is on every axis. So it's here on the Z, and on the X axis it looks like about like that. That looks, yeah, that's pretty right. A little bit. Let's fix the top one now again. Just kind of fiddle with it till it looks about right. There we go. And then we'll do confirm the compound angle. And what that does, now when I rotate this, it uses this empty as its parent object. So you can have something on this wacky, like off-kilter angle. This shows you this is actually the angle that that flap is sitting at. But according to the flap itself, it's at 0. So if I rotate it from 0, now it looks like it's on the proper axis when it flaps up and down. Car doors, trunks, things like that always need the compound angle to be zeroed out according to the object itself. Here's some stuff for working with highlighting objects, object drivers, yeah, and the reference off and on again. So those are some of my 3D tools when I'm editing. When I'm already in a project ready to render, that's when I start using the Animagraff, the Graph Tools panel over here. Let's go down through these sub-panels and have a look at some of the tools I've made. Append, this is really cool. When you're bringing in objects from other files, sometimes they bring in a ton of stuff with them that you don't want, and that adds a bunch of file weight and does it secretly, so you can't tell it's happening sometimes. Like, Blender tries to do its best, but it's a complex program, so let's append something from just this same trophy truck. I have a bunch of versions of it. So let's go, we'll get an object. This is gonna bring in a ton of garbage. I don't care, let's just bring in body. So here it comes, it's gonna take a minute, yeah. So I brought in the body from another file. If I click on report here though, I've set it up so that this append button is different from the file append. It uses the same basic functionality, but this append function, when I click that, it saves the state of all the assets in Blender. Now when I click on the report, it tells me every category that had something added to it. There were 2 Bezier curves added. It added 3 images. I might not have expected that, I guess for the texture on the body though. It added 5 different materials, 7 meshes, 8 node trees in the shader, 13 objects, and 3 different action keys, so there must be animation on the body. I also have it so that when I save the file, there's this little notification that tells me this is the original file size, this is the added file size between saves, and here's the new file size. That's just the blend file size on my hard drive. So those are a couple of amazing tools to keep the file weight down and to keep an eye on it seamlessly. As I'm modeling, I can just take notes of how my file size is growing. This resolve duplicate node groups, like in this body, for example, since I brought that in from another file. Oh, yep. So these are like the standard nodes that I use for my project, and I've crafted these nodes so I reuse them. .001 means that when I brought in that truck, it has that same node from another project. So if I do resolve duplicate node groups, that will go through all the materials, and now you can see that it's brought it back to this node, but that was already existing in this file. And it deletes that copy that was made when I imported that material, because I reuse materials a lot. And remove duplicate materials is the same thing. If I bring in tires from another project and it has black rubber or something, but I already have black rubber in this project, that will delete the duplicate and bring it back to just the one material. So that's another way of keeping things very clean. All right, so alpha groups. Alpha groups is how I link all of the collections, the native Blender way of organizing things, right? Link those up to sliders in the animation, the graph editor. This is the graph editor window. I can fade them out. So if I do exterior and bring this down, you can see it fades out. Every object in that collection fades together. And this is something that I've seen people online asking a lot about, this system. And no, it can't be done natively in Blender as such. I had to write code, but I'm going to show you the nuts and bolts of how this was done, because the idea is simple. The implementation can get a little complex if you want it to. I'm going to show you the code for alpha groups, right? Okay. When you want to start coding your own Blender stuff, you can make a panel, and then in that panel, the buttons, they call them operators. Everything in Blender has operators. If we go to Object and look at any of these, when I hover over this, I've turned on a thing called Python tooltips in the settings in Blender. You can see that it says Python bpy.ops.transform.translate. That's the actual command in the code that this button is going to call. So my operators also have their own little name like that. And this operator, I define that in the code in my own plugin. As I go down through what this operator does, generally speaking, if I look at this truck object and go to the object color, click into the object color, this operator puts a driver on every object in every collection that runs that alpha color. So if I right click on alpha and go to edit driver right here, you can see what this driver is doing. Let's go to the drivers window though. I have a couple other things going on here, but the one we're interested in is the A color. That's the alpha color. This is being run by a property that is on the world. So on the world in Blender, your world object, you can set custom properties. This is just where I decided to place these. I could create one right now. I could make a new property, go down to the bottom of a huge list. But there's my new prop right there. And I can use this to run things. I can right click and say, copy as new driver, and I can paste that somewhere, like on the rotation of the body here. There we go. And as I run down this property, look, the body rotates. And it makes this field purple because it's saying, hey, there's a driver in there. If I go to my drivers window right here, drivers, the X rotation is being run by prop on the world, right there, prop. So I can delete that out of here. So this A color is being run by a world property called exterior. But I'm not setting these by clicking this new property button. That is what I'm doing in the code. So here at the top, I'm saying make a world action if it doesn't have one, because the action is where Blender holds all of its keyframes, all of its animation keyframes called F-curves, those lines that tell you how something is animated. These that you can see here are all the F-curves for every fade in, fade out, all that stuff. the code is saying, make sure the world has an action. When I click the alpha groups button to update it, I'm basically wiping out or saving everything that's there, wiping it out, and then remaking the list, because thinking about what object moved where and all this is just too complex. So I just wipe it and then rebuild it. It's really fast. Blender has no problem doing that. So I'm also saving the state of the groups. So if they were open or closed, that matters to me. I don't want this thing to like reset every time I hit alpha groups. Where this comes into play, if I'm in the engine, you know, and I'm like, oh no, like I need this set of pipes to fade on its own, you know? Right now, that probably fades with all of the exhaust. There it is. Yeah. And I'm like, I need those pipes to fade on their own. All of a sudden I realize that halfway through, I've already got keyframes on exhaust, and I realize I need some more specificity. I'll take this, go back to my modeling window, and I'll move it into its own collection. Let's call it first pipe, right? First pip. First pipe. Then I'll move that back into the engine group. And EF. Whatever. I'll go to alpha groups and click that button. Now first pipe shows up, and it shows up in the order that I listed it in the collections as well. It doesn't automatically alphabetize that. It respects my ordering. So now with first pipe, I can fade out just the first pipe. So that's how I do that. Like when I'm rolling through a project, I might not know yet how much detail I need to get into until I'm actually animating things. So I've made it very easy to take something, put it into its own collection, and get it animated really quick. And I can also right click here and copy the keyframes from the collection it used to be in and paste them on that new object. So now it has all the keyframes from the group that it was in. So this thing essentially works. Nothing has changed, right? It works like I expect it to work up to this point in the animation, and then I can branch off and say, okay, I want exhaust to fade down, and I want first pipe to stay there, which is exactly what it will do. If I ever want this to be run by the exhaust again, so I don't have to like fade both of these throughout the whole rest of the project, I can go in here and set an override on first pipe. So first pipe is being overridden by exhaust. I click alpha groups to confirm that change. Now, this can always run on its own, but if I set it to -1, that means that exhaust, watch this, exhaust is now controlling that category again. You can only do this to one level of abstraction, but I made it so that you can split out into detail and then come back to simplicity. If you're like, I just want to fade the whole engine, I don't want to fade all these things and do that the rest of the project, to have to fade 20 things every time. I just need the engine to come in. So you can split into detail and then go back to simplicity with this system. It makes it easier to do that. The beauty of this as well is that this way of handling all these sliders and the animation window, let me make it big. This is a lot of this is native to Blender, so locking these. One of the things that I use a lot, as you saw, is if I unlock this F-curve channel, that will set a keyframe where I'm at. That's actually keyframing right now, right? But if I just want to audition it, I can lock it, and then I can go down through these and start setting a bunch of things. And that orange color means it is not keyframing. It's just putting the value into that field. But if I animate a little bit, the animation window says, hold on, like this is the keyframe that's actually there. If I grab some of these and unlock them, and then I start coming down through here and setting values, those are keyframed now. They look, that stays, when I animate it, it stays faded out. Oh, that's me talking down here. So that's something that Blender already has built into it. So the cool thing about linking up all these collections, finding a way to program those so that it lets me have these sliders and the F-curves in the animation windows, then I get to use all Blender's built-in stuff to handle it from there on out. So back to my code. Yeah, take the collections list, right? It only goes 2 levels deep. So I don't go, if there was another collection inside of here, alpha groups won't read that. So it's only 2 levels deep. And I'm cheating a little bit. I use this indirect only. If you go into the restriction toggles, I guess is what it's called, in the outliner window, you can turn on a bunch of other tools in Blender for turning collections on and off. And this disables them in the viewport. So the monitor button removes them from the memory, the working memory. The eyeball doesn't. The eyeball quickly hides them, but it will still be a really slow viewport with a lot of objects in it. But if I do all off and then turn on the engine with this little monitor icon, those other objects are like not in the memory of Blender anymore. So that's the difference. The eyeball quickly turns them off, but they still kind of exist in the RAM on the computer. But this monitor icon like takes them all the way out of the RAM, I think is what it is. So the viewport is really fast at that point. So where was I? Oh yeah, so this part of the code is reading all the collections, just the first 2 levels, and it's seeing if it has this indirect thing that was in Blender already. I just decided to use it because I don't use it for anything else. If I have that clicked, then it doesn't read this as an alpha group. So let me show you what that means. Right now with the engine group, there's the header called engine group, but that collection is not in the sliders. And if I take that arrow off and do alpha groups again and go over there, look, now engine group as a whole is also in these sliders. But this collection, I'm using it just as a holding container. If this had an object in it, like a cube, then this would be using that slider, but it doesn't. I'm just using it as a container. So I have a way of clicking that button and I click alpha groups again, and it uses that just as like the header, but doesn't put a slider in there because I don't need it. Yeah, this takes all those properties on the world, those custom props that I was setting to drive these sliders. It removes all of it, and it remembers, again, if it was expanded or not, if it's locked or not. There's a part in the code where I'm like telling it to remember all that. And then it recreates all of it. So it's putting all the groups back based on the collection names. This takes every object and this is where that driver is added. Yep, if it's a mesh or a curve, I don't want it to add color drivers to empties and stuff like that. So that's this right here. It adds this color driver to the color, the 3rd slot, which is the alpha slot, because in programming, arrays oftentimes start with 0. Yeah. Color number 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. So it adds it to the alpha, and it's adding this driver. This is how I do it. This code adds that driver to every object in there based on the collection that it's in, and it links it up to this F curve, which is being driven by these world properties over here. I know that's not gonna like a tutorial to help you set this up yourself all the way, but that's the gist of how I'm doing it. You could like go halfway and put your own world properties and just move those around when you delete your collections or whatever, but this is just seamless. The other things in that window, all off turns off, all disabled viewport and render at once, all visible turns those all back on, because this is hard to do if you're trying to roll down with your mouse on all those. And this can also include sub collections. So right now, the sub collections, if I have some of these turned on, you know, and I do all off, it doesn't affect that second layer in the hierarchy unless I want it to. So I can go all visible, and now it will turn everything on and the second layer. So that's what that's for. Previews allows me to just recall certain collections if I want to quickly do that. So I can set them, and let's do all off, and then I click previews. It turns on just the ones that I set. So that's just a fast way of like flipping between a couple collections that I want to turn off and on really quick, especially if I'm previewing and the viewport's really slow and I need to see what a camera shot is doing. I'll just solo like just the body so I can see where the camera's at, and I can do that by setting those little preview collections on and off. The export panel. This exports timestamps. When I bring my audio in, every little audio clip is named from a paragraph number in my script, and I put markers around it when I import those into Blender. The export function takes where these markers are on the timeline and puts a time to it. It exports just a standard CSV file. Here's the marker name and the timestamp, and I do that so that when I'm doing things like ad breaks on YouTube, I can program where those are. Or when I'm setting the chapters in the video description, this is so helpful to the, oh yeah, 2.0, what was I talking about at 2.0? Oh yeah, that's the engine. Oh, 3 minutes, 40 seconds. And the audio markers that takes every marker here and puts it inside the wave file so I can use it in other software. Like, wave files can bring with them marker data, which is really helpful for things like Adobe or whatever, when you bring in the wave file and it has all of my script markers with it. So I didn't know that was possible until recently, until like this year. But that is really powerful. There's often not very good ways of transferring timeline markers to other softwares. When I did the first couple of projects, I didn't have this, and so there's 15 minutes of me talking, and in order to make any edits, I have to like click through the timeline and listen and be like, oh, where the heck am I? So it would take days to get stuff done. Where now with this, it's just a lot faster. We'll look at labels in a minute, but let's first look at the render panel, because I'd render the project first and then I'd render the labels. Right, so there's the output folder, which just follows Blender's native output folder, but it's just here at a convenient place. I can go to a certain frame. This is cool. When I am checking my renders, I'll often put frame ranges if I find problems. I'll put the frame numbers and I can copy a range of frames like that and paste it into one field here, and it puts it to both of them, which is really handy. I can reset the timeline to my in-out points that I had originally set if I was messing with stuff. Sync visibility. This system of fading things in and out, I've made it so that if I look at my render sync visibility script, this script runs when Blender renders. So you can have a script and they have these handlers, and the handler is saying, before the render frame loads, do these things. And there's some handlers for like when a file loads. You can have handlers for when you save a file. That's how I get this little pop-up right here, the file size. I have a save handler. So this is the script that handles that. It says before I save, take the file weight and then calculate the after file weight and then report it to me. So this little thing here is like putting that in a little text box for me. And then you have to register these with Blender right here so that it loads when Blender loads. The render sync visibility is saying, if I have faded out a collection all the way to 0, don't load it. So if I go back to the alpha groups and I say visibility sync right there, this is reading the timeline. Let's go to like 4,000 on the timeline, frame number 4,000, visibility sync, right? So this is everything that's visible at that time in my video, and visibility sync turns on and off collections based on what has been faded to 0. That visibility sync in Blender does the same thing that this script is doing at render time. It's saying if I faded it to 0, don't load the objects. If I'm just focused on the engine or like one pipe, the only thing even being loaded at render time is that one pipe. That is what render sync visibility, that's what this script is doing for each frame. This checkbox turns that script on and off, because when I am working in a project, I don't always want that to be happening when I'm trying to test stuff. If I want to see if there's a problem somewhere, I may want to just be able to go over here and turn these on and off myself and have Blender work as it normally does. Okay, this big render job button, that's my render button. I turned off, I think, the hotkeys for render animation because, let me show you this. If you render with Blender's normal way, render image is fine. You get this little render progress down at the bottom. I don't know if this will work, it may crash. Oh, it worked, okay. Then you go to the render window and there's the frame, right? Sometimes I do use this for one frame, but if I do render animation, it locks the viewport. So I can't move off of this window now. And let's say I'm like, oh, I forgot something. I need to stop that really quick. I can hit escape and it'll say canceling. Oh, that actually worked. Great. It's because I'm filming. But most of the time when I try to cancel a render, it'll just sit there and freeze the window and say canceling, and I'll get the pinwheel or whatever. And it's just a big pain. So I don't use Blender's, the viewport here to render. I use the command line. If you go into Windows, and you type CMD, This is a command prompt, and it's just a really old school way of controlling the computer or whatever. So Blender can be launched from here, and what this does is it opens up a separate instance of Blender, and it only opens up the parts of the program it needs just to render. So it is super lightweight, super trim, super fast. And if I want to close it, I just come down here and right click and go close window, and boom, the render stops. So let me show you how that works. Render job. There we go. It's starting to render frames. That's it. If you go to the Blender documentation has instructions on how to render from the command line. So you launch the file in that little command hacking window that I showed you, and then you can put these little flags in there to tell it to do certain things, whatever you need it to do, jump frames or render this as a video. That you can control everything in Blender, but from these little flags here, and then there's the file, animation, the starting point, the out point, all those things. So my little function here, you can use Python. Let me show you. This is the code for that render button. Just open the bat file. That's basically what it's saying. Create the bat file and run it. So it runs the command line render according to how Blender tells you to set up a command line render. That's all that's doing. But as I was saying, like it opens up its separate little process. It's really slim and fast, and I can just right click and close the window and it stops it. And this becomes really important because if you look down at my render settings, right now I don't have it. I unplug it when I'm not using it, but I have a second GPU that I use. And through the command line, I can launch multiple instances for each GPU. So I can have like 2 or 3 blenders for the 3080 and 2 or 3 blenders open for the 2070. I know these are old cards, but I usually upgrade every 5 years, so there's that. We're almost due. But the command line lets me open up multiple instances of Blender to render on those cards, and I do that until I see in the task manager, I do that until I see that they're full, that like I'm pretty much, within like 80% or something of where I want to be. Otherwise, with just one instance, Blender doesn't really use all the memory or all of the GPU memory, and that's probably a good thing. It would probably melt your computer, but I like to push things at render time, so I use that command line render to open up multiple blenders on each GPU. And all you have to do that is just keep launching that window. So in the code, yeah, I don't even remember what this does. It's been so long, but like this in the bat file, if I set how many instances I want to open up down here, okay, watch this. And then I click render job, watch this. Okay, see? So it's launching those little command line windows, but I put 3 instances, so there's 3 different windows that are rendering now concurrently. I don't have my other GPU hooked up, but there would be 6 windows rendering concurrently if I had 2 GPUs. And again, I can just go down here, right click, close all the windows, and that wipes out the render job. And my Blender application is still cool as a cucumber and is not like having trouble running. Like I'd have to have 6 Blender windows open to do the same thing if I was using the interface, which would be an absolute nightmare to manage as a render job. So before we get into the render settings, let me show you these couple things here. So preview render just uses your output folder, but this is what's called an image flipper. So there's a ton of these, and this one's called MRV2, I think. When you have folders full of thousands of images, like my hour-long videos are like 100,000 frames. It's a huge amount of images. Previewing these as they are without having to open up Premiere and drop them in there just to see what's going on. Like you don't want to be opening other applications just to see what the animation is like. So an image flipper is really fast at just playing the images that are in the file as a video. So if I hit play here, that's what's in my render folder right now. That's all these image files that you see. And you can scroll through it. I can get the frames. I can change colors. If I was like a VFX guy, you can look at all the color that's happening. And then they're really lightweight, so you just close it, boom, it's done. So that's how I preview those frames. Render stats. If I go to my scripting window, I have a render stats text file. And if I click render stats, this just shoots out a bunch of statistics about the current job that I'm working on. So
it's going to be all out of whack because the frames that are in the render folder don't match up, and I'm not currently in a job, but whatever. The job size, like how many frames I need to render, what percentage of those are already rendered and remaining in the frame numbers. The average render rate I'll calculate for each minute. I'll calculate how many frames have rendered, and that way I can see if it's what I expect it to be, because rendering is another place where if you're not watching things, it can get totally out of control. So for the beginning of the video with the entire model and all, I'm showing the whole thing, 18 frames a minute is pretty slow, but it's expected. Once I get down into specific things like just one pipe or one little tire or something, this should be up to like 60 or 70 frames per minute. It should be ripping through there. And so this render stats, that little thing here, just puts all that out to a text file so that while the render is happening, I can keep an eye on it. Another thing that I watch while rendering is I have all of the temperatures of my, this is just a separate program called HW Info, and you gamers out there will know about this one, but it's keeping the temperatures of my CPU, my motherboard, and my GPUs. The second GPU would be down here as well. And I have a program called Fan Control that right now is not working because, again, I take out my second GPU and I'm not using it, but it would have that over here. And this way I can just blast every fan on my computer when I start the render job. And this is the best way I've found to just control every single fan, all the case fans, all the GPU fans, the CPU fan, and have different curves and whatnot and what I want that to do. So when I'm rendering, I have the temperatures and the fan control open, and all of those command line render windows just blasted, and then I start ripping through frames. But yeah, that's how I kind of keep my head straight when I'm trying to render 100,000 frames, in 50 or 60 minutes of 30 FPS video. So continuing down through the render settings, you already saw the GPUs and the instances. The way this works, by the way, with Eevee, it's not like Cycles where you can automatically have it split between GPUs. You have to go into NVIDIA control panel, and I think this is based on the program settings. Right, so I have I'll show you. This is a separate Blender exe that I copied, and I call it Blender-2070. I tell NVIDIA that when I open Blender-2070, I want you to use my other GPU. So the way to find that is to go to the Blender, the actual where Blender is on your computer. And you can see I have, here's normal Blender right here, and then you can just copy it to Blender-2070. That's how I split the renders between cards. The way that Eevee renders, there's no other way to do that. It can't do it like Cycles where it automatically shares the render between however many cards you have. Here's a cool thing down here. I have found that when you're trying to find errors, jumping frames is a fast way to preview. Let's say I have 10,000 frames I want to render in an evening. I want to render every 1,000th frame and just make sure everything's going right? The problem with that is, if I just jump to those different parts in the frames, I can't actually see some problems that crop up. Like if something is wiggling, or there's one really common one is clipping, where two objects will be really close together. And if they're too close, then Blender will cause a bunch of artifacts to happen where they're too close. I can't catch those problems if it's just frame 1000, frame 2000. I won't see the movement. So what I do is I say, jump 1,000 frames, but then render 3 consecutive frames. 0, 1, 2, and then 1001, 1 and 2, 2001, 1 and 2, right? This way, now if I click into just my image viewer, I can arrow key through that, right? But it's still a little hard to see what's going on. What I want to do is ping pong, so I want to go back and forth between those 3 frames, like that, and see. Then I'll be able to see if something is kind of wigging out, or if some of my rigs aren't working right, or if there's clipping, or if the colors are doing something crazy. I need a couple of frames, and I also need it to ping pong. I want it to loop back and forth. That I have found is the most powerful way to check through a big render job and catch almost every error. This is a recent thing. I ended up finally coding a solution to do that for me. If If I do preview frame skipped, this launches just an old version of Blender into the video editor. And if I do load preview image sets, it loads all of those images into Blender. And then just uses, if I click next set, it just uses Blender's timeline preview function to set a preview range. And what I did was make it so that it automatically does like a ping pong loop, because it goes 0, 1, 2, 1. And then this just loops. So it's like it's going back and forth, back and forth. So this is previewing that first set of frames for me right there, just in Blender's video editor, but just like an old version. If I go next set, then it does the next set. See? It like ping pongs that little animation back and forth. Next set, and this way I can catch most errors that would be happening in an animation before I commit to the entire render. Yeah, see, that way you'd really know if there was something screwing up in here. I would know that by now because everything else looks great. This really helps you see. Yeah. So, and then I can, I can clear the timeline, refresh. I can, if I'm deleting images, I can do it from here. So I delete an images and it gives me a little warning. And since that frame was repeated, it tells me both the places that it was at. And it also deletes the image from my hard drive. So now that image 5001 is no longer here. And I can just close it and head back to normal Blender. So I'm pretty proud of that. Like a frame skipped render with consecutive frames is just a super powerful way of saving yourself literal wasted days of rendering time. All right, and then down here I just have some render file management. So if I have a render job that's like 10, frame 0 to frame 10,000, let's say I check that render at frame 2,975 and I do my preview render, right? I'm like, dang, that actually looks pretty good up to like frame 2,000, right? I sync the timeline, and what that does, it moves my in and out points to the last rendered frame. So that's 2,976. And then I can move these image files. And what this does, in my render folder, I only have the set of frames I'm working on. Because in my experience, once you have rendered a bunch of frames, you don't want to touch those things. You want those things to be locked away and kept safe. So that is the rendered frames folder. This is my storage. In the actual active render folder, I only have the set of frames I'm working on. So this button here moves those frames to storage, and it tells me how many frames there are and if I'm, if I'm overwriting any frames, because I would certainly want to know. I may not want to be doing that. So that's what that does. Sync timeline, move image files, clear incompletes. When I stop the render, some of those renders will be in progress. So in the file folder, there might be like 5 or 6 frames down here that are 0 kilobyte file size. And I just want to delete those quickly. So that's clear incompletes. Right now there are no incomplete files. And then this just deletes everything in the render file, but I kind of, in the UI, I placed it on its own because I don't ever want to accidentally click that. And then there's a delete file range for deleting a range of files, and I can paste an image range from my text documents. If I notice in the render that there's problems, I can just quickly delete a range of images. Because again, I don't really want to be in Windows like trying to be like, oh, frame 4,100 to frame 822. Like, it's so easy to make mistakes when you're doing it this way. Like if you're just, fiddling around in the Explorer window to handle, tons of frames and different frame ranges where there could be problems. No, this right here, if I do delete file range, it tells me how many I'm going to delete. If there was a range of files, it would list them. It's just a lot nicer. So I write these little operators again with little pop-up windows just to help me not make mistakes like that. All right, so that's the render panel in my graph tools. And now we can go back and look at labels. Labels I render as separate frames because I don't want to mix the 3D model and the little text vocabulary words that pop up. If I go to the labels panel, this format labels file, when I write my script, I put it in a table with those section markers. And then I put the labels off to the side here. I can copy paste this table, download it from the script, and then Python can take that file and it takes every label, puts a number here in numbered order, the section that it's in. So this is in section 0.4, right, in the script. And then there's the label text. And what that does for me is that if I turn the labels system on in Blender right here, it makes it so that it lists all the labels in order, because Blender will respect that number, right? Number 13, number 14, 15. And this is the text object and what it points to. So if I go into the camera, let me not get ahead of myself though. So that's the format labels file. Then create labels. When I have a bare file, like a starter file, the labels are just a couple of objects, you know? It's, again, the text itself, and then I have the object that it points to, right? So that little airplane wing thing we made earlier, I can put the label target to the cursor so then it'll like quickly kind of point to what I'm trying to make it point at, you know, the line. Create labels duplicates these basic label objects based on that CSV file and all the objects that needs to work correctly. So if I click on any of these and go highlight label, it helps me stay focused and know which label I'm working on when I'm placing them. When I turn place on, this is for placing labels once they're created. I'd be in the timeline window here. I'll usually switch my graph editor to the outliner because I just want to see a fat list of labels, right? And then I have my same graph tools open in another little panel over here. This particular label right here, 22.5 hours, whatever I'm talking about, it fades in and fades out. And this is just the standard Blender timeline right here. So if I click on next label, that goes to the next label in the list. And I can find the alpha keyframes for that. So this is how I place all the labels. I just click next label. And it goes to the section. It goes to the section marker and highlights the label in the outliner and selects the text for me. So this is really fast. Like, I have 121 labels in a 35-minute video. For the SR71, I think I had like over 180 labels. I have my audio open down here and I move the fade into the exact part in the script where I'm talking about it, you know? I do alpha right there, and that moves that label alpha to right where the playhead is, the cursor. And then I go next label. There we go, there's that label. So that's how I place all these labels. And when I want to preview and see that they're in the right spot, I just push play and I click next label. See how it's going down and jumping to the next label as the timeline plays. When I go to render them, I don't want any other collections visible. And I tried to do this in a separate scene, but the problem is that when I'm parenting what the label is pointing at, I want that thing to stay with the object, you know? If that object is also driven, other scenes can't recognize that driver, so it'll just be floating off in nowhere. So I have to have all these labels in the same scene. That's just the way it works best. Plus for placement to like see where it is. It's just better if it's in the same scene. So when I turn render on, it turns off every other collection. And then it just sets a bunch of settings for render. Like I turn off depth of field because I don't want the red lines to be blurred based on how close they are to the lens. This create empty images. When I render labels, I only render the frames that the label is at. The gaps in between those labels, I just have a Python function that creates a bunch of 0 kilobyte image placeholders so that when I bring that into Premiere, it won't bring in those labels if there's gaps between the frames. I did want to show you as well for the coding aspect of things. You'll want to toggle just the Windows Python console. It's a little confusing because Blender has its own little Python console, but you want it to look like this one. At least for now. Blender changes so much in the future, what I just said could be irrelevant. That's why I don't make tutorials. In that console window, if I say for every object in context.selected object, so if I have many objects selected, print O. In the console window, it's printing out or it's telling you how Blender sees those objects. So it can be that simple, you know? That's your first little program right there, right? And if I do O.name, then it prints out just the name, you know? And anyway, I just wanted to say that like I'm not a programmer, at least I wasn't until now. And even though my Animagraffs tools has a lot going on, it turns out to be like simple things just repeated many times. Real programmers, you know, like can get deep into like abstractions. I know you want to keep it simple and readable, I get that, but like they still do things in ways that are when you're a pro at something, you become a pro. I mean, you get really good and you can abstract and like make things really efficient. So my code is not that. My code just gets done what it has to get done. I started coding because there were other channels that I watch on YouTube, like even people that do like, fixing cars and stuff like that, but they always encouraged me to like get in and just try and try not to get too overwhelmed. Even though it's gonna be overwhelming, just try to do something small and don't worry if it's the best. And like, that is what got me started into trying to code this stuff, because I was super scared of code. I was like, I'm not a programmer. I can't understand that. My brain doesn't work that way. I'm an artist. And then I found out over time that I can in fact do it. And it's by starting on something simple, you start to feel comfortable with that. And you're like, oh, I think I can add to that. And then next thing you know, I'm rendering, six console windows wide, maxing out my CPU and controlling all the fans like a mad scientist. That I've developed over 2 years of writing code in between each project. I take a week and I just write my tools because now I enjoy it. I love solving problems. Like, I'll take a note in the project. I'm like, ooh, this thing didn't work. I did not enjoy that. And the next time I come back to that in the next project, it's a button click and it handles it for me. It's so satisfying for the tools to be reliable and I can just click and it handles what used to take me hours. I'm crafting these tools myself. I'm like solving a bunch of stress for future Jake. And I find that the coding time between projects when I'm working on my Animagraffs tools is really interesting to me. Sometimes it is more interesting than parts of the project itself, to solve these little problems so that my tools are like really shiny and sharp, Anyways, that's my Animagraffs tool set. Hopefully that's been instructive.